Yeah, people will not see all the drop downs. So, and I went halfway through people when saying I can't see the drop downs. So my recommendation is you do desktop. Okay. All right. So first question, how many of you have worked with pivot tables at all before? Just give me a yes or no in the chat box, just so I have some idea. Because this isn't introductory. I'm assuming, you know, people have varying knowledge. So we have some people who have, we have some who haven't. Okay. Okay. All right. So let me start by just going over some basics about pivot tables and the requirements for pivot tables. So a pivot table is a particularly unique subset of tables that works well with what is defined as transactional data. So people automatically assume they hear transaction, it has to be a sale, but it doesn't necessarily only have to be, certainly sales or transactions, but anything where there are individual events that are where each event is a row. So what I have here are examples of data that would work for a pivot table. So this first one we're actually going to do, I gave you a template for this, but I just took a subset here, would be like traffic infractions, okay? Or if I was in facilities, each building use event, which actually is almost like a sale, okay? But also things like accident reports, with each accident being an event, or if you're just doing mileage reimbursements, each mileage reimbursement with an event, or handicap stickers. This is just another example. So the key with all of them is you have to have these just requirements for pivot tables. You have to have a header row that is descriptive, meaning things like date, you know, etc. In a regular table, it's recommended you have a header row, but you don't have to have it, okay? In a pivot table, you must have it because that's going to determine your fields. Second thing, there cannot be any blank spaces. They foul up pivot tables. Also, it must be in this order. So you can't have if this data was inverted, it wouldn't work, okay? But typically our data tends to come out this kind of a way. So the first thing that I want to go over with you, which by the way has applications beyond pivot tables, it's useful for other things as well, are just some tips on how you clean up your data. Because things like, by the way, the one thing I cannot give you a tip on is typos. If there's, you know, if elementary is spelled one way and then it's spelled a different way, that's going to show up as two items. That I can't fix. But other types of cleanup I can do, including getting rid of extra spaces. So the first thing, and look, if I have a very, very small data set, I would probably just do this with an eye, you know, by eyeball and delete the blank rows. But if you're talking about thousands of rows, then you want a handier way of doing this. So let me just take you through the steps to do that. So the first thing that you want to do is you want to highlight your data set. Now, this is not a pivot table yet. It's just data. It could be in table format to do this, though. And I want to go to find, and I want to go to special. Now, it's important that you highlight, because if I'm going to ask it to look for blank spaces, your whole spreadsheet's full of blank spaces. So you want to do it only for the highlighted areas, and you're going to look for blanks. And you're going to hit OK. So now it's identified the blanks. And then you're going to go up to the top of your screen. Actually, if you just click delete, that'll do it. But if you want to be a little more granular, you can say delete sheet rows, and that will get rid of your blanks. So any questions on that? You want me to go over that again, or you got it? And I can just I actually can quickly do it again because it's so fast to do. So basically, I'm just going to highlight the items. I'm going to go to find. I'm going to go to go to special. blanks, that's going to highlight the blank items. Then I'm going to go to delete and tell it to delete the sheets. Okay, so once again, how many of you are familiar with that? So our next two that I'm going to go over are text functions that are extremely handy. And they're not just handy for pivot tables, they're handy actually for any tables to clean up your data, okay? And so the first one I'm going to do is, and I'm going to show you how you can combine them, but I wanted to break them up so you could see it. So what I have here actually is food service sales in a cafeteria. And this is just actually for one day, probably not even the whole day. Okay, and I intentionally messed up the list. So I've got pizza capitalized, I've got it lowercase here, I've got an extra space between fish and sandwich. Here, side salad is capitalized, here it's lowercase. So just, common things. And I will tell you, a lot of times, if you're working off a system like a point of sale system, you really don't get these kinds of errors because the system will input a certain way. But if you're working with data where people are manually inputting it, for example, a survey or any kind of a form, it isn't uncommon. How many of you experience all these kinds of things? Then there are the ones you can't even see. So one of the ones that you could see is a leading space. So here I have an extra space by hamburger. But if I had a trailing space, that would be really tough to see, okay? Really difficult. There is a way to format so you can see it, but it's hard. So our first function is called proper. Now there are actually three functions. There's lower, upper, and proper, but the most common one to use is proper. So basically what you're going to do is you're going to go equals proper and then select the cell. And I could do it here again, just to show you, so you can see me actually doing it. And then I'm going to select the cell. And what that's going to do is capitalize the first letter. It will capitalize the first letter of all the words. So if you see here where I had side salad, it did capitalization for both words. Now, if I wanted all lowercase, I can do lower. If I want all uppercase, I can do upper. How many of you are familiar with the proper function? Yes or no? So our next function is the trim function. And what the trim function does is it gets rid of extra spaces, gets rid of leading spaces, gets rid of trailing spaces, basically gets rid of all the spaces you don't want. Okay, it's kind of an all-in-one. So once again, I'll show it to you here, even though I had it in the template done already. Okay, because here we have an extra, if you notice, there's an extra 2 spaces on between fish and sandwich, there's 2 spaces. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go, just so I can have it all on my screen. Trim, whoops, wrong. And I'm going to go, and I'm just going to select the cell. Actually, I should select the original one here. Okay, and it eliminated the extra spaces. Now, if you're thinking you have to do this individually, you do not, okay? So for example, if I were going to do, and again, I'm going to show you how you can combine them. But if I'm going to do trim, and I can select my first item, I can now scroll down and it's going to do the trim for all of them. And as you can see, it eliminated the extra space. So you can actually combine them. And order does not matter. It doesn't matter whether you nest your trim inside your proper or your proper inside your trim, but this is a little bit of a shortcut. So here I have proper parentheses, then I start the trim function, and then I end it with 2 parentheses at the end. By the way, if you're ever confused on how many parentheses you want, count the functions at the end. So here it's 1, 2. So I'm going to need 2 at the end. So once again, I'll just show, I did it already, but I'll show it to you. So, and this time I'll do it the opposite way, by the way. Okay, so here I'm going to do, it doesn't matter which one I nest in the other. Okay. And now I need 2 parentheses. So now I've covered both of my problems. I've made everything uppercase and I've eliminated any space. So it doesn't matter which order. You can do trim first and then proper first and then trim, or trim and proper. It just does them both. Any questions? How many of you could see that as really useful with a lot of data? Okay, so now we're just going to talk about creating a pivot. Now, this first data, I'm not even going to really analyze. The one I want to focus on is, in the interest of time, I want to do the magnet one with you. But I'm just going to show you the step so you can see how it's done as to how you create a pivot table. So you don't absolutely have to do this, but it's recommended that you do 2 steps, which is you take your data. And by the way, this set of data, probably I didn't even have to highlight because there's no spaces. So if I had gone anywhere in this data, it would have worked, okay? I'm going to go insert and I'm going to create a table. So it asks, do I have headers? Which I do, because my top line is date, department, category, cost. Okay, and so now I've turned it into a table. And there's a whole bunch of stuff you can do with tables as well. I actually did another webinar on tables. I know Deb Orgarten had expressed an interest in tables. I'm going to send you the recording. I meant to do it this week. I forgot because I already had done that one. Okay, and there's a whole bunch of stuff you can do with just tables alone. But we're going to look at pivot tables. So now we've put our data, and I like to get rid of all the lines. You know, you can do colors if you want, but I just took it out. And then I'm going to go back in and I'm going to insert pivot table. So I'm asked, where do I want to put it? It's usually highly recommended you don't put it on the same worksheet. You can put it in the same workbook, but not in the same worksheet as where your data is, okay? So normally if you do a worksheet, it's going to create a tab in front of where your data is. And now you have the start for your pivot table, okay? And what you're going to get is a little field area. We're not going to see anything, yes, and you're going to get your field list, which in this particular case is very few items. But it's, and then as you select them, it kind of guesses where you want to put them. But I'm going to give you just a little tip before we look at a real serious data set. A good tip for checking your data is to take each one, not the amounts, but each one of them that you could think of as a descriptive category, like department or type. You want to put each one of them in the rows. And it's funny, it did it automatically. And you want to take a look at it. So here already you can see a problem. It was an intentional problem. Can anybody tell me what it is? Okay. So the problem here was transportation was spelled wrong in one of them on my data set. So that was by intention. I did that on purpose. Okay. So in one of them, I didn't have an S. I believe that's where it is. Now, sometimes you have to hunt for it. Little tip, by the way, is do a search for the error. And then when you find it, correct it. So you can go up to the find and do a search and find your error. Now, pivot tables do not update automatically. So you're still seeing it there. You actually have to go, by the way, whenever you create a pivot table, you're going to get 2 tabs up top. analyze and design. We're going to spend a little bit more time talking about that. And even I sometimes forget which is under which. Most of the things you need are under analyze. You will only see it if you're in the table. So if you go out of the table, you won't see the tab. You have to be anywhere in the table, okay? So now if I go to analyze, you're going to see refresh. I got to find it here. Where is it? Refresh. By the way, I believe you can also do it with a right click if you're in the table. We can, and I'm actually not going to do it yet just to prove that. If you go to, and you're in your table, I believe refresh is up there. If not, you can certainly, yeah, it's right here. So you can do it one of two ways. You can either go in to the tab and hit refresh, or you can right click, but I'm going to refresh. Now that eliminates the item. So pivot tables don't automatically update. You have to actively do it, okay? And now I clean that up. The second thing I'm going to do, and again, this is more preparatory, I wanted category, not cost. And I'm going to do the same thing here. Oh, God, I pulled the wrong one. By the way, if you have an item and it's not what you want, you can just pull it out. So once again, I'm looking, these are books, paper, I'm not finding 2 pens. So now I know I have good data. So we could just do a very simple pivot table just based on 2 dimensions here. And then I'll show you one that's a little more advanced. So, and I will say, when you're working with pivot tables, a little bit's trial and error and taste, okay? So by the way, if a lot of times it'll put it down in values, if it's an amount, it's going to give you the amount. If it's a descriptor, like pens or pencils, it counts them. But I don't want to do either here. I'm just going to move this over to columns. Now, the only thing I have to do is put the cost down, and that usually will do automatically and put it into the value. So now I have my pivot table, okay? And then within the pivot table, I have 2, you would call them buttons, that allow you then to limit what you're looking at here. So the initially would be all of them, but let's say I only wanted to look at elementary and middle school. By the way, interestingly enough, this is just a quirky thing. A lot of times if you took an item out, when you refresh, it still shows up on the list. There is a way to clear it, and I forgot about it now. But if you selected it, nothing would happen, okay? So I now can have my data for elementary, and then I can always reset it. Can also do it in ascending order and descending order. So everybody okay so far? Pretty basic. So we're going to go on and look at a really a more practical example. Okay, so I'm intentionally going to copy this to another sheet only because it's one of these things that's hard to undo. Okay, so I'm just going to create I got to move my Zoom tools around here. And so I've just put this in a new sheet. So we can start with this data from scratch. So I'll tell you what this data is. So this data is for a magnet school. The last place I did the training was in Maryland. So these are all counties in Maryland, okay? And what I have is the name, just the last name of the student. You could certainly have more detail, the county, the program, the grade they're in, and their gender and the tuition. So I'm not going to use all of them for this pivot table, even though they're all in there. So what I'm going to do is, so you can see the steps again, I'm going to insert. I like to always put my data into a table first. Then I'm going to go and come back to insert and create a pivot table. I'm going to do it in a new worksheet. It's going to put it in front. Now it doesn't name them. So I'm just going to call this pivot main, and you'll see why I want to name it in a minute. Okay, so here's what I want to do. I want to use this so that I can actually send bills to all of the counties for their individual students, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select students, and I'm just going to put their names in the row. And again, you could do it a different way. Again, some of this is trial and error, but I'm going to do a program in the column. And because these are bills, I do want the tuition. So now I have a list of the students, and I have a list of the program they're attending. This is a high school. They have 4 programs, okay? Everybody with me so far? So now what I want to do is, this is a 2-dimensional pivot table. Why is it 2-dimensional? Because I've got a row and a column. So what if I have a 3-dimensional item? I want more than that. Yeah, I can do it a couple of different ways. So one of the ways would be to put county here. And by the way, the order you do it is going to affect what you see. So here I now have it by county, okay, with a total at the bottom for each county. But that still doesn't give me, I still would have to do a separate bill. So even though I could certainly put 3 items by category, I'm not going to do it that way. I'm going to take county out. So I'm back to my original data. And I'm going to show you a couple of ways you can do it. So the first way will teach you something some of you may know of or not, and that is the use of a slicer. So you got to be in the table. You now insert slicer. Now I can do a slicer for any parameter, any one of the fields. However, in this particular example, I want to do a slicer for an item that isn't in my table now, a field that's not being used. I want to use county. And it's going to produce a slicer. So that is a slicer. How many of you have seen or used a slicer? Yes or no? Now, it's interesting. When you're in a table, you get a table analyzed. When you're in a slicer, you get a slicer analyzed. So, you know, depending on if you like a different aesthetic, you can pick a different color for your slicers. Now, the way a slicer works is you can reset it to all. You can select any one. And now I'm getting the bills for so I theoretically could select one, then print it. I could select another one and print it. I could select another one. If I want more than one at a time, I have to hit on a Mac, it's command, I believe it's control on a PC, and you're just going to highlight more than one, okay? I probably would not do this for billing, but you know, if maybe they were regions and I needed to analyze, I can always go back and show all by just going up to the top and doing the X. Interesting thing about a slicer. If you eliminate a slicer, it doesn't reset. So if you accidentally delete the slicer, actually it did in that case. That's interesting. Okay, I guess if it's ones that are within the table, it won't. But if it's another item, it's unfiltering it. Okay. All right, so that's another way to do it. But here's the one that's really sweet. Okay, by the way, anybody have a question? Okay. So here's the one that's really sweet. Okay, I am going to take my county and I'm going to place it in filter. Now, when I place it in filter, I can now use a button to select a category. It's working the same way as the slicer, but with a button. And it's showing up top. See, it says counties all. If I selected just Allegheny, you would see Allegheny, okay? But here's the really cool thing. This is the sweet thing. So I could do it for all of them, but for the time being, I'm just going to do it for a few to show you that you don't have to do it for all, okay? So I'm going to select like 4, all right? And now what I'm going to do, and if I selected all, it would work for all. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Pivot Analyze. I'm going to go to Options. I'm going to say Show Filter Pages. Now, this is one of these things you can't undo it. If you do it, you got to delete each one of the tabs. But watch what happens when I do this. I love this. And by the way, if there were more than one thing in the filter category, I could do more. But here it doesn't make sense. I only want to filter by county. So watch what it does here on the bottom. It creates a tab for each individual county. So here we go. I got my billing done. Not only can I print each one, but I have a record, okay, as well as I have my full data set. Okay, any questions on that? You want to see it again, how you do it? Yes, no, or you got it? Okay, all right. So that's why I only did 3, because I don't have to take out 12 of them. So I'm just eliminating the tabs. And in fact, you know what I'm going to do? I'm actually going to do the whole thing from scratch. I'm not going to do the how you create the table itself, but I'll do the whole table from scratch, just to show you that if you really got the hang of this, it doesn't take very long. So I'm pulling all the data out. We're going to start from the beginning. Okay. So again, what you do, it comes from experience, whether you're going to put the students in the row or the column, but I think it looks better with the students here. I'm going to put the program here. I'm going to select, I could also put grade, if that was an important thing. And then I'm going to put the tuition. Okay. So now I have my basic data set, but I want to filter by counties. So I'm going to take county. It'll usually place it in in either a row or a column, but I'm going to move it to filter. This time I'm going to do one for all of them. Okay. So, well, whoops, let me actually get rid of Allegheny too. I think if I don't, it's just going to give you Allegheny 1, Allegheny 2, but let's clean it up. Okay. So now I have to be in the table. I go to Pivot Analyze. I'm going to go to Options. I'm going to select the middle one, which is Show Filter Pages. It's going to ask me, what do I want it for? Which in this case is only show it one choice, which is county. And now it's actually, now it created one for every single county. I have all my billing done. How's that? Pretty cool, right? Yeah, I really like this. And this does not have to be billing data. This could be, any filtering by program, by gender, general ed, special ed, whatever you want to do. But I think one where it really saves you a lot of work is when you're dealing with a thing where you might have to bill. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to do one that's more of a traditional analysis type. Oh, that's interesting. I'll take a look. Yeah, an analysis type. Okay. And then if we have a few minutes, I'll show you a few more tricks. Okay. So for this, I want to go back to my second set of data that I gave you, which some of the, and I think I have a couple of people here who are in that category too. So most of my clients are either school districts or universities, but I also have clients who are work for cities and towns, particularly in New York State. I work with the New York State Association of Government Finance folks, which are kind of the equivalent of business officials for counties and towns, okay? And so I produce this data. It's fake data, so we're going to do an analysis, but don't make any inferences from it that it represents real life. Okay, all right. But what we're going to do is I'm going to go through the steps so you can see how I create a pivot table again. And on this one, we're going to do a little bit more of an analysis of results. And here again, I probably did not have to scroll down. I could have, because I don't think there are any blank spaces. So once again, I'm going to follow my practice. First, I create it into a table. Yes, it has a header row. And then the next, I'm going to go back into insert, and I'm going to create a pivot table. And this one, I could have put in another tab as well, but I could leave it here. It's fine. Okay, and so what we're going to do is I'm just going to call this traffic study. So once again, just to go through the steps, there aren't any errors here. So I know the results, but typically what I would do is take something like infractions and I look it over. Am I finding that there's one that's duplicate, which would be indicative of a typo, okay? But I can tell you now there really aren't any here because I know this is good. And a lot of times, again, you may not have a problem with that because the data may be coming off a system, like a ticket system. So the likelihood, since they're drop downs, it's not likely you'd have an error, okay? So in our first analysis, I want to now analyze patterns of infractions by gender. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put, and I'm not really terribly interested. I'm not interested in the amount of the tickets because that could vary by what the judge, I'm more interested in just the raw numbers. So here I could select for value, either my gender or my infraction. Either one is going to give me the result, as long as it's not the amount. So I'm just going to go and pull gender into values, and that's going to give me the count. Just to show you, I could have done the exact same thing and selected infraction. I'm going to get exactly the same data. Okay, so now I have my data. Okay, so here's where, you know, this comes more in the line with aesthetics. Maybe I can make a decision about whether I want the totals on the bottom. So in this particular case, I think I want the rows, but I don't want the columns. So I can just say, get rid of the columns. Okay. So analyzing data with raw numbers is tricky. So what I want to do is convert these numbers to percents. And I can do that through the pivot table itself. Now, by the way, there's a lot of options here, but I'm going to tell you 90% of the people only use 2 of them, maybe 95%. Okay. So you're going to go to your count of infraction. You're going to hit this little I. I think it looks slightly different on a PC, but you're going to select it. You're going to go show data as. And I'm going to get this list of ways of showing the data. So the ones that you're going to do are either usually percent of row or percent of columns, unless it's a really crazy analysis. So here, the only one that really makes sense is percent of rows, because I really want to compare. Each row is a different infraction. I really want to compare what I see as patterns between males and females on each individual one of these. So I'm going to select percent of row total. Now that is going to convert my data to percents. So this is a lot of data to look at. Now let's narrow it down. Okay. So I'm going to show you a couple ways you can narrow it down. And they accomplish the same thing, but let's just look at DWI and DUI. Okay. So again, fake data. So don't make any inferences. Okay. So what we see here with DUI is the males, it's 2-to-1 and even higher on DWI. Okay. All right. So, any questions? So instead of using this, I think a sweeter way of doing this is to use a slicer. Okay. So I'm going to go to pivot analyze. I'm going to insert slicer. And by the way, you can have multiple slicers. You're not limited to one, but we're just going to start with a slicer for infractions. And again, I have a lot of options. Once I have a slicer up, I'm just moving my my zoom tools around the screen. I can kind of like play around with the way this looks, the slicer looks. So because this is a lot of data, I probably would prefer 2 columns, and I'm just going to widen it out, okay, so I can see everything. All right, I'm actually not even seeing everything yet, okay? So maybe 3 columns would be better. I'm just trying to point out that you have some choices about how you're going to handle your data. And I can change the colors if I don't like those colors. Okay, so now I can do the same thing. I'm just going to hit on my PC command, those 2. And now, whoops, it was the other way around. Let me do it the other way. And DUI, I'm back to having DWI and DUI. Okay. Any questions so far? So this is already an analysis, right? It's more in line with an analysis. So I can go a little further with this. I can go into my table because you're not going to get your analyzer unless you're in a table. And I can ask it to give me a chart. Now it gives me choices on chart. Usually it gives you a chart it thinks is the best chart. And then at that point, you can change it if you don't like that chart type. So now I have my pivot chart. And whenever you have a chart, then you get a chart analyze and a chart design. And I usually get a number of choices of different things that are already pre-done for me. If I'm not happy with that, I can certainly go to the elements and, for example, more granularly change it. So right now it's at the inside of the end. I can change the data to the base, or I can change, usually the one I change the most is the label. But I have a choice. I can do different ones, okay? So now I have a table and I have a slicer and they're dynamic. So if I wanted to look at failure to signal, I can just hit failure to signal and that's going to change my chart. Failure to yield, change my chart. So I could be sitting and doing a presentation on data and go over each one. And the chart's going to change dynamically. Okay. So I'm going to, and in some cases, there's only one selection. That's why you're only seeing blue or red. Okay. Any questions? So one of the questions I got asked last week was, do I have to have the table in the same tab? I'm sorry, my chart in the same tab as my table? And the answer is no. I can copy it. I could cut it, but I'm going to copy it. And I'm going to create a new tab, which I then can label nice and fancy, right? So now the question is, well, how do I control it? Well, there's a couple of ways. Number one, I could copy my slicer. That's one way. And now it's dynamic. I can change it. Or if I don't want to copy it, it's fighting me. I think I'm having a lockup situation here. Hold on. Let's see. In which case I may have to shut down this sheet and reopen it. Let me see if it'll even let me save it. And I was doing so well so far. One never knows. Okay, I'm actually going to end up quitting Excel and come back in a second. My apologies. That's the one thing I can't control. While we're reloading, any questions so far? So now I can recontrol my table. So I want to, this was actually a different one. It was the same data that I had done this morning just to practice. So I want to show you another way to do that. I'm not sure I did the copying. Copy. So now if you have a chart, you don't necessarily have to copy the pivot from the table. When you're in a table, you get a table tab. When you're in a slice, you get a slicer tab. When you're in a chart, you get a chart tab. Okay. And in your chart tab is a slicer. So I can select the infraction and put it there as well. So I wouldn't necessarily have to copy it from the other one. And again, we'll just, clean it up. And now it's dynamic. And if it doesn't lock up again, no, it's working. All right. So I just want to show you one more trick, and then I think we'll call it a day. This is a beginner class, and I don't want to overwhelm people. Okay. But I will stay around after I stop the recording if anybody has a little bit more detail. So I want to go back, and for this purpose, I actually want to begin with my data set again. Okay. Because I want to create a separate pivot for this. And you can absolutely create more than one pivot table with the same set of data. Okay. So, and I had done this already, but I'm going to do it again. So this time I want to look at the data by age. Very similar analysis, but I want to look at age because it allows me to show you another little trick, okay, or tip. So once again, I have my data, and this time I'm going to select age. And again, I'm not interested in the amounts of the tickets because I'm really looking more for, frequency. So it's more events than the amounts. And that's what these are counts. But I do want to do it as a percent again. Okay. So I'm going to go, it gives me a chance for me to show you this again. So again, I would want rows because I want to look at each individual infraction. So here's the problem with this data. It's too much. Actually, it may have made a decision to group it because of what I did before. So I'm actually going to correct this. And then I'll show you what I mean. Okay. So I'm going to ungroup my data. Sometimes it remembers. So this is impossible to analyze because there are, from 18 to 81, there's, like 30 categories, right? So whenever I have a category, either a row or a column that involves a number, doesn't have to be only age, could be dollar amounts, could be dates, which Excel treats as numbers, or an age. And what I want to do is I can go anywhere in the list, and I'm going to go to group. So you're going to right click and select group. So here it's going to give you what's your lowest value and your highest value, but I can adjust the starting ranges. So let's say I want to treat everybody who's 21 or under as one category, and pretty much anybody over 70, I'm going to treat as one category. And then for the rest, I wanted to group it by tens. So I could do 5s, 15, 10s. And now I have a more manageable data set. So here I have the percent who are under 21. I have 21 to 30, 31 to 40, and then anybody above 70. Now, once again, I could filter it if I just wanted to look at DWI and DUI. I could do that, and there's my analysis. Okay, any questions? So if you have a large data set or you're dealing with dates, you definitely want to group them because you won't be able to get any meaningful information, okay? So let me almost stop. I want to show you one other little trick and then we'll call it a day, okay? But let me stop. Any questions? How many of you are familiar with grouping? Yes, no? Okay, good. All right. So I'm going to unfilter my data again. I don't have to ungroup it. And you're not limited to the total, but usually the best one is for the total. If you ever misplace or can't remember where your original data is for your pivot, you can get it back by double clicking the total at the bottom. Now, you are not limited to that. I can actually get any of the subset data for any of these categories that way. But if you want the whole table, just double click. So watch what happens when I double click. It now gives me back my original, this is my original data. But I could also do it in a more limited way. By the way, it'll just create another tab. I could also go in and say, I just want to look at the data for the 21-year-old, 21 and under. And I can double click here and it'll give me a table of that. So you can actually create subsets of regular tables out of a pivot table. So likewise, if I wanted the totals here, I could have the totals here. So it's really good if you can't find your original table, or if you're looking for a subset of data, and these tables do not have all the data in them. This only has what I selected. So anytime you pick any total, if you pick your grand total, that's going to give you everything. If you pick a subset of either a row or a column, that'll return you the data for that row or column in a separate table. Okay, that's a lot to cover in one shot for a beginner. So what I'm going to do, and it's just my custom and stuff like this.